Donc, bienvenue à notre session à propos des perturbations à l'horizon, perspectives canadiennes. Donc, c'est un espace où nous allons explorer ce qui pourrait arriver au Canada les prochaines années. Donc, à Horizon de politique, comme vous le savez, nous explorons constamment quelles sont les circonstances, les événements, les innovations qui pourraient émerger et modifier la façon dont la société fonctionne, comment nous vivons, comment nous travaillons, comment nous nous interconnectons. Et bien sûr, dans notre recherche, il y a plusieurs thèmes qui reviennent très souvent. Par exemple, la possibilité que dans le futur, nous vivrons dans une société potentiellement où nous ne ferons plus la différence entre ce qui est vrai et ce qui ne l'est pas. Les gens ont aussi peur du fait que les systèmes démocratiques et de santé s'écroulent dans le futur. Il y a aussi de la peur par rapport à la réalité de l'endroit et de la façon dont nous vivons en raison des changements climatiques, que ça se matérialise. Et aussi, bien sûr, on entend souvent parler de la crainte que les besoins fondamentaux ne soient plus satisfaits dans le futur. Alors, ces perturbations, ils pourraient ou non être les prochaines tempêtes importantes. Cependant, il y a de plus en plus d'imprévisibilité et d'incertitude, plus que jamais. Alors, ce qui peut sembler lointain dans le futur, impossible ou improbable, pourrait soudain être la réalité dans le présent.
Recording in progress.
Alors, pour explorer toutes ces perturbations auxquelles le Canada aurait peut-être besoin de commencer à se préparer, j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter notre modératrice de cette session, Cheline Curtis-Mikhaïev. Elle est la sous-ministre de la Justice et sous-procureure générale du Canada au ministère de la Justice du Canada. Elle est également membre du comité de direction des sous-ministres de l'Horizon de politique. Et bienvenue aussi, bien sûr, à vous tous pour apporter vos idées à cette discussion. Donc, bienvenue, Cheline, et merci de nous guider dans cette conversation tellement importante. Je vous passe la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Cristal. I am so pleased to be moderating this session. It's a very important conversation at Futures Week. My name, as was mentioned, is Cheline Curtis-McAuliffe. I use the pronoun she, her. Et j'aimerais reconnaître que je suis sur le territoire traditionnel des peuples autochtones, le groupe Algonquin Anishinabeg. So it is with great excitement that I get to moderate this panel. Disruptions that we will discuss in this session are things that could emerge and significantly impact Canadian society. And while it is not possible to know for certain what disruptions will occur, talking about them supports decision makers to identify possible future challenges, seize opportunities, and create robust and resilient policy in the face of uncertainty. So I would like to welcome our panel of distinguished speakers today. I look forward to hearing from their thoughts, and they will speak in this order. We have first Almin Yal-Nizian, economist and Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers. I have with us Andrew White, CEO of CHIR Technologies, a clean tech company. Dr. Mark Tyndall, public health and infectious diseases physician and founder of MySpace Society, and also Jessie Wente, journalist and the chairperson of the Canada Council for the Arts. I will be asking two sets of questions to each speaker. So without further ado, let me get started. So Armin, as an economist, you continuously explore and analyze trends and shocks to a wide range of Canadian issues. Can you share with us what you see as emerging in the next decade that is not on the current agenda but should be?
Thanks for the question, Cheline, and thank you very much for including me in this incredibly important conversation. I am speaking to you from the banks of the Ottawa River, which is unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And when you live on the edge of a river, you see constant change and constant uncertainty as to how that change is going to flow. So Christelle just talked about how things are more uncertain than ever. I suppose you can say that every season as the seasons change, and increasingly so over time. In fact, the river is flowing quickly, and we are talking, as you just did in the previous session, about reshoring and friendshoring, global supply chains. You were talking about the headwinds that are going to make it very difficult for central banks everywhere around the world to contain inflation. Whereas, in the 1990s, when they were very successful at doing so, they had a lot of tailwinds. They had China coming on stream. They had lots of labor shortages. And we saw this growth in a global supply chain that was the most efficient that the world had ever seen. All of these factors are now reversed. And the last factor I will bring in is population aging. Any country that had a baby boom after the Second World War is facing the same existential threat to growth. And every party of every political stripe that has existed since the 1970s effectively has placed a policy priority on economic growth. But population aging means we are all competing for newcomers at the same time, and we are all looking at the potential of more exits from the labor market than entrants too. Now, I'll talk about technology in a second, but the real big issue right now is this domestic focus for public policy in a way that has not existed since the 1980s. Since the 80s, we've been talking about global policy change and moving in lockstep. Now every country is going to be really focused on these issues: population aging, inflation, and how much of what we need are we making ourselves. And here I'm going to say that if we do not play this card right on how we are providing basic public services like health and education, or housing and transit, and basic access to internet, we will not be the people magnet that we have been for the last 100 years. And if that takes place, we are looking at a contraction of GDP over decades and a loss of quality of life of the people that have lived here. And don't forget, we are still the 10th largest economy in the world. This could happen extremely rapidly. We do need to prevent the transition that is taking place right now. Even though we are spending more money on the care economy, which is health and social assistance on one side of the economic ledger and education on the other side. This combined contribution to GDP is 12.6%. It's well beyond oil and gas and any kind of mining and auto manufacturing, but we talk about it as if it's a derivative part of the economy. It is actually the driver of the economy, and increasingly it is appearing in the crosshairs of private equity, who want it not to provide care. They want it because it provides real estate from which they can capture rents. And so we are looking at an existential threat to the nature of publicly funded basic services that are increasingly being commodified to yield rents to the owners of the property, and that will always and consistently downgrade the care part. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because we make a lot of fuss about remote work and AI and all these technological changes that could genuinely disrupt professional life. I imagine most of us on this call work at a desk job or a knowledge job, and they see that remote work is the future of work. In fact, in Canada, it affects less than about 1 in 5 people can do remote work, and that's shrinking as employers want more and more people in the office. So the disruption that could be taking place is professional jobs that get decoupled, the tasks get decoupled from the job itself and done from not Barrie, Ontario, but Bangladesh, because that's a cheaper place to do it. We have not seen that kind of disruption in the labor market since the 1970s offshored manufacturing jobs. Here we have an opportunity to make every job a good job in the care economy. It is 1 out of 5 jobs, exactly the same share of the labor force as manufacturing was in the 1970s. We have a chance to make every job a decent job, but what we are doing is commodifying the sector and putting actually devaluing the value of the work to provide care for one another. This isn't something that is going to get automated. It is the possibility of building the spinal column of the next middle class, and yet we're not talking about it. We talk about it as a labor of love because it's primarily female work. We consistently undervalue the work that is done and how constant it is in our lives and how much we rely on it from cradle to grave. So this is an area that I'm hoping we will absolutely dig into, because this tighter between public and private provision of the basic things in life is going to be a big flashpoint in every country around the world that is dealing with this trinity of problems: affordability, population aging, and reshoring and friendshoring work.
Thank you. Wow, that is a lot to dig into. I appreciate that, Armine. Andrew, the Government of Canada is committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. We must keep innovating to meet this goal. Your clean tech company was chosen by the Canadian Innovation Exchange as one of the 20 most innovative publicly traded tech companies. How do you see the potential in Canada to create clean tech innovation in the future? And what type of disruption might that create? How do you see Canada as a global player in technology that supports sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm honored to be here and share the panel with the other esteemed speakers. It's a great honor, and I really think that there's a great opportunity for Canada to be a leader. I mean, we applaud Canada's net zero commitments, and if we do the right things, there is a great opportunity for Canada to lead in the sustainable space, the climate tech space, the clean tech space, whatever sort of new buzzword we want to use. If we do it right, there's some great opportunities. So maybe 10 seconds on Char to put my comments in context. We take things like wood residuals, so leftovers from forestry operations, and we turn them into a biocoal. So this biocoal is a solid carbon that's needed for things like steel making or nickel smelting, where the chemistry of that process needs solid carbon. So we look at the future of steel, we look at the future of energy, where metals like nickel are going to be needed, and how do we reduce the energy consumption and make these processes more sustainable. So that's kind of the lens or the framework in which I bring to the table here. And so I think my first comment is probably the disruptions or the innovations are already here in this space. The common phrase is from an entrepreneurial journey, the 10-year overnight success like BlackBerry. So that 10-year overnight success for whatever the next disruption is, whatever the next innovation is, it's already here. It's in the universities, it's in some lab somewhere, it's being developed. And so I think the real question is, how do we help extract it from either the university or the lab or sort of the skunk works of a large company and get it deployed in a way that creates an ecosystem in Canada that we can build off of. I think, we have some really world-class university research in the space, but unfortunately, the Canadian story tends to be that research gets pulled over to the United States or over to Europe or other jurisdictions outside of Canada. So one of the great things that we're seeing is, this mindset shift at the university level towards entrepreneurship, and that entrepreneurship is a good thing, because for a long time, the universities would publish papers, which is really important, and they would license technologies, which works in certain industries, but not in things like energy. So seeing that move is really helpful. There's a lot of early stage funding here in Canada to help that initial move out of the lab, which is fantastic. We've, received a lot of that over the years and been able to grow from sort of my grad research at the University of Toronto to the company we are today. So some of that stuff definitely exists, but what we really need to understand is just the scale of industrial energy use. And again, that's coming from my lens of it, but we received some funding from the Canadian government to build a demonstration plant, and the output of that demonstration plant making biocoal would offset 25% of a single blast furnace's consumption for 8 hours. So we'd have to run our demo plant for 1 year to make just enough material to demonstrate this works at an industrial scale. And that, I think, is one of the big challenges, is in other jurisdictions where there's a lot more private risk capital. we see these technologies get shifted to those jurisdictions where they can go through the commercialization stage. So one of the things that we saw fairly recently, and I'm very encouraged by, is Canada's response to the United States Inflation Reduction Act. So one of the key elements, I think, for building this sustainable clean tech leadership is the concept of production tax credits. Because where we're at right now is we have a bunch of government funding, which is, like I said, super important to get technologies out of the lab into a reasonable scale. But then to meet the scale of industrial users, we need to be able to guarantee the output through things like production tax credits, which then allow that private capital to come in, that first full-scale commercial plant to be built, and then we're off to the races. And just sort of a closing thought, for us, steelmaking is certainly ripe for disruption. Globally, it accounts for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, just steelmaking. The United States is 9%. So it's a really big, meaningful challenge to take on. From the Canadian perspective, nickel smelting, copper smelting, all of these minerals that are going to go into batteries have the same issue of needing carbon and needing energy to be made. So because of that background that Canada has, I think there is a great opportunity to set this up appropriately. And then once we have that leadership role, in our example, now that we're leaders in biocarbon, we have all sorts of interesting inquiries from industrial players to say, hey, you make carbon for this, can you make carbon for that? We really want to grow our sustainability. So it's kind of getting that critical mass. And I think in this sector, the disruptions and the innovations are there. They're at the universities right now. I've seen them. It's just getting the acceleration of the process to get them out, deployed, and contributing to our net zero commitments.
Thank you, Andrew. Mark, our healthcare systems have been strained by the pandemic. Climate change and environmental stresses could give rise to a cascade of global health risks and emergencies. Can you share with us, as a public health and infectious diseases physician, what perfect storm of circumstances should we anticipate that is currently now being underestimated?
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the question. So I believe there is every reason to believe that infectious disease outbreaks will continue to occur, that our healthcare system will be unable to cope, and that we are seriously underestimating the risk. The emergence of new pathogens or pathogens that previously infected other species are ever-present threat. In my own medical career, I've lived through two global pandemics, COVID-19, which remains fresh in our minds, and HIV. COVID essentially shut down the whole world for 2 years, had economic costs in the many trillions of dollars, and has social and environmental implications that we still don't understand. While it killed over 7 million people, the surprisingly rapid development of an effective vaccine and strict lockdown policies in many countries prevented the death toll from being much higher. HIV has killed an estimated 40 million people so far. Antiretroviral treatment has greatly reduced mortality and viral transmission, but another 40 million people still live with the virus, and we have no cure or vaccine. There have been other regional outbreaks of concern like dengue, Zika, Ebola, monkeypox, and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, but none have yet reached global proportions. The chance of new global pandemics has increased dramatically in the last few decades, mainly due to rapid environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, more people traveling, and the sheer density of cities and slum areas where people live. A recent UN report estimated that by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population, or 4.6 billion people, will live in urban slums. If you expand the purview of public health beyond contagious pathogens to include mass migration, famine, and regional conflicts, the health impacts of changing climate are difficult to even fathom. In the past year, I've had the opportunity to live in Bali, Indonesia. I have explored parts of Southeast Asia through hiking, scuba diving, and eco-tours. I am saddened by the environmental degradation, water pollution, deforestation, plastic-filled beaches, and gridlock traffic congestion. But at the same time, I have been amazed by the biodiversity and the beauty that remains, and the incredible resilience of the natural world, how forests can be restored, coral reefs can be enhanced, and threatened animals can thrive in the jungle. In my meditation work, I have been introduced to the concept of scarcity and abundance, and I find it useful to look at the environment and health through this lens. Through the lens of scarcity, we have done unthinkable damage to the natural world, and in places like Canada, we are still extracting oil, cutting down old-growth forests, and building even wider highways. It is incredibly irresponsible and threatens our very survival. Our children and their children face a very uncertain future. Through the abundance lens, however, we can see that what remains and envision the preservation and even restoration of what we have destroyed. In 2020, David Attenborough, now 97 years old, made a remarkable documentary called A Life on Our Planet, which is his defining statement on the natural world. He documents the massive loss of biodiversity during his own lifetime and the impending global catastrophe if we don't wake up. While he shows how humans have essentially conquered the natural world and created devastation on every continent, even he remains somewhat optimistic that the world will wake up in time to make a difference. So in answer to your question, I believe that we are already in the perfect storm for global pandemics, but I'm not ready to give up hope that we can still change course.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And I think that's why we're all here, is to look at how we can evaluate what is happening in our environment and think forward to address that and to change course. Appreciate that. I will move on to Jesse. Jesse, one of the concerns that Policy Horizons Canada is researching is that our information ecosystem will become flooded with machine-generated content, and that people will no longer know what or who to trust. So you were a broadcaster and a culture critic for more than 20 years. In your view, what is the likelihood of this happening? What are the areas of society that this could cause major shifts in, both negative and positive?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. And I'm very humbled to be included among such great minds. And it's wonderful to have all of my nightmares confirmed in such a erudite and lucid terms. It's really, it's going to be good for my night's sleep tonight. I look forward to that. Yes, thank you so much for the question. I worry, I now have many worries, but I have worried a lot about our loss of our inability, our growing inability to discern what is real. It will not just, and this will not just make us confused, but frankly unable to settle on a shared reality. I think that's the real threat of machine-generated content, is the speed at which it can spread and our inability to discern it from what is real. And that is, if that becomes increasingly difficult to have discussions about the very real issues that we faced on. Of course, our realities are all shaped by individual experiences, but generally humans have always relied on some shared points of recognition and acknowledgement. If those linkages are under increased threat, which I think they are, and should they break, it is entirely possible that we become unmoored from anything real. This is obviously exacerbated by our increased reliance and existence within virtual spaces. Now, I think we're actually already in the midst of the flood that you described, although it's not necessarily machine-generated content that has brought us here, but very much more human-created content fueled by human-created distribution systems that prize engagement above all other concerns in search of profit. Our shared information ecosystem has already been fractured and corrupted by algorithms meant to stir reactionary emotions to further engagement and time spent within the algorithmic world. So away from the real world, we spend much more time in virtual spaces than we often do in real spaces. If you look at, say, the usage of phones by average people in North America, at least, many people spend 8, 9, 10 hours of their time on the phone which I'm not sure we can call the real world. The introduction of large language models or generative AI or other such technology will likely only further exacerbate this existing problem, as often this AI is being created with the same intent, to monetize every moment of human activity and to capture as much attention as algorithmically possible. We have already experienced the effects of this as part of the vast erosion of trust in institutions, science, and even democracy itself. And maybe underlying all of those things, our growing inability to communicate with one another despite living in the communication age. An inability to communicate, to find community outside of monetized and algorithmic spaces will leave us further vulnerable to all manner of likely crises, be they viral, political, or environmental. So I think we need to see large investments in education and learning spaces, as well as large investments in communal spaces that do not require fees to enter or participate. This includes both cultural spaces, sporting spaces, and simply gathering spaces, the stuff that in our own communities we've slowly lost, the places where we all just used to hang out and meet with one another. Those have been replaced by these digital spaces that are entirely monetized through algorithms. We must find ways to create community again that are offline, as the largest problems everyone here talked about already exist offline. They're not online issues. Education should increasingly involve critical thinking, media literacy, and mindfulness as core principles, so that we better prepare people for existing within the information ecosystem that exists and that is so often harmful. We need to foster new institutions that are more reflective of modern reality while reforming or abolishing existing institutions that have failed to address the systemic issues that have led to an erosion in the trust we have in them. I think the positive parts, and I do, because I don't want to be totally negative, it's not all doom and gloom with all this technology stuff. I mean, the positive stuff is that I think our capacity to solve some of our problems, should we be able to communicate and exist in some semblance of a shared reality, we can now gather as we are today in a way that we just wouldn't have been able to before. And that might be less harmful to the environment and to other things that we gather like this. We have faster modes of communication. I think we have the abilities to problem solve if we use these as tools and not as substitutes for the community that has been so eroded. We need to see these as things we use to build community, not as community themselves. So in short, we need to be together in person more often, or at least sharing the same spaces, real or virtual, more often, so we begin to reform our understandings of one another and relearn how to be with each other as communities. Miigwech, 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 miigwech.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you for those comments. Very insightful, and as speaks to communities. And Armin had started off with the care and how we needed to take care and find ways to make meaningful ways for jobs in the care industry. So we're back to community and care, and I'm back to Armin to ask you another question around the possibility that in the coming years, a significant proportion of Canadians may actually struggle for basic necessities like water, energy, food, shelter, and education. What do you see as the likelihood of this happening? And is it a disruption that you are worried about?
Oh, yeah. I'm very worried for all the reasons that Jesse brought up. Look, we're pack animals, right? We define ourselves in relation to one another, and those relations and how we define ourselves are changing dramatically. I couldn't agree more with Jesse that the ultimate definition is between making money and making community. So we are going to be having to define what is our public policy priorities when we have when we elect our representatives. What are we electing them to do to represent our interests as human beings? So I think actually the distinction is becoming increasingly, when I started my career many decades ago, I was defining economics as a thing that people created. Whereas almost all of my colleagues were defining it as something that money created, investments create, business creates. It's like there is no business if there's no consumers, and there's no consumers if we have no source of income. But when you start commodifying everything under the sun, you kind of lose the plot of why we are living together. So I think that is like a really big existential issue on how do we define the problems we are facing that are not virtual, that are not online, that are material circumstances that we need to sustain our bodies, minds, and spirits. So I think there's going to be a real showdown in the coming years about what we are trying to do. And I myself am not feeling like totally, I mean, I guess I want to channel a little bit Mark's comments about abundance and scarcity. It's like, I think the jury's out on which part of the yin and yang we are going to settle for, because I think it's going to be very easy to convince people to get rich quick, you know? And so long as we put our premium on money and making more money, and that's the headwinds we're facing right now, is that things are getting less and less affordable. And so you start thinking more about money. How do I get enough money to afford the things I need? I think the conversation is tilting in that direction instead of tilting in the direction of what can we do together that is outside of the market to give ourselves the things we all need to survive. Because we do live in a world where there's more money than we've ever seen before sloshing around, and yet we can't seem to harness it for the things that we basically need to survive. So I'm afraid that for me, the jury is out, but it's a hell of a fight to be part of.
Wow, very passionate, and very, it resonates well with the comments that we've heard. I especially Mark's comment about 2/3 of the global population in 2050 living in urban slums brings home the issue. Andrew, if I can come back to you, thank you, Armin. Come back to you, Andrew. Your company is one of the players in the transition of energy systems from fossil fuels to renewables. The shift might be difficult and unexpected disruptions might emerge. What would you say to people who are worried about potential energy uncertainty in terms of availability, reliability, and cost?
I mean, my first answer would be the existing system we have is already filled with uncertainty and unreliability and cost. And there's, a couple of examples, right? It could be a branch falls on a power line in the US in the early 2000s and the entire eastern electricity grid goes down for days. There was an ice storm in Montreal, 2 months ago, and the West Island of Montreal was out of power for 5 days. Or if you're relying on a diesel generator somewhere off grid in the north, then you run out of diesel, the engine breaks down, your power is gone. So I think there's already uncertainty. It's just uncertainty that has been generally accepted broadly across the board. And to further that, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and then the follow-on sanctions, we had steel companies in Canada whose fossil inputs, because they're still primarily using fossil coal, quadrupled in price. You had steel mills in Europe shut down because they couldn't afford the natural gas, and obviously all the energy uncertainty that goes along with that I don't need to get in here for this audience, but there just is a lot of uncertainty anyway. And our model, and we're certainly not the only ones who are proponents of it, is generally speaking having some better distribution of energy, be it making biocoal and renewable natural gas, or making electricity, or storing power. Once you get a well-defined distributed energy system, there's a lot more robustness and a lot more reliance available there. It's just really getting away from the centralized, you need one large power plant model. There's a lot of work to do, obviously, to shift not just mindsets, but also the technical aspects of how that all works. But I think we're working well into that approach. And along those lines, it's also that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So right now we're in sort of one of the hydrogen euphoria bubbles, I guess you could say, where hydrogen gets really exciting and then it drops and then it gets really exciting again. When you look at some industrial processes, to make hydrogen through electrolysis, which is how we usually make it, you would need an entire Pickering nuclear power plant right beside the industrial process to run the electrolyzer to make the hydrogen. So hydrogen has some great applications, but it's not everywhere. So that's what I mean by, not a one-size-fits-all solution. And the same goes for things like battery tech. So there's some really, really, really good battery tech in the Canadian universities. Again, back to that, where is the disruption? There's some awesome stuff that's not lithium ion that would really support this transition. It's just, we got to make that connection to get them out into the world.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So Mark, if I could bring it back to you, you 20 years ago led the way with our first legally sanctioned, you've supervised injection facility in Vancouver. And we're going to see more innovations in the next 10 years. What do you think those might be? And how could they have a disruptive impact on the health of Canadians? And what paradigm shift is needed in those situations?
For the past 25 years, actually, my public health practice and research is focused primarily on addiction and the people who use drugs. And I believe that our current approach to drug use in Canada and globally is cruel and irrational, and we have failed to understand the massive human and societal costs of prohibition. My introduction to drug use was through studying HIV prevention programs where we essentially allowed thousands of people to become infected with HIV by denying them access to clean needles and basic social supports. And more recently, we have failed to act as over 35,000 Canadians have died from using an unregulated and lethal street drug supply. We are still paralyzed with inaction and cling to this crazy idea that we should be a drug-free society or just say no or just stop using. So if you're looking for an example of an area in need of a complete paradigm shift, it is drug policy. The incremental changes that we have made in Canada are just not going to be enough. Our country's drug laws are completely out of step with what is going on in our communities. We have taken the most traumatized and unfortunate members of our society and decided to punish them for simply trying to numb their unbearable pain through drugs. We still believe that punishment and shame will dissuade them and others from using drugs. Not only do we show indifference to the human suffering, we spend billions of dollars to ensnare and arrest and imprison people for their drug use. It's really insanity. Ironically, harm reduction or lessening the health impacts of drug use through providing things like clean needles, supervised injection sites, supportive housing, or a regulated supply of drugs are considered radical, while living on the street, selling sex to survive, running from the police, or dying of an overdose is not considered radical at all. In 2019, I introduced a program to provide hydromorphone, an opioid that acts like heroin, through a biometric machine. The program, called MySafe, is a low-barrier, safe supply project designed to give people an alternative to the lethal drugs that they are buying on the street. An independent evaluation was published this week in the Canadian Medical Association Journal and found very positive results. So providing a safer supply of drugs to those who are dependent is the only way out of the current drug poisoning crisis, a crisis that has been created by prohibition and deadly drug policies. Changing people's minds around prohibition is very challenging, as we are inundated with images and media reports about the devastation that drugs cause. We blame drugs for homelessness, mental illness, and violent crime, when it is the criminalization of drug use that causes these outcomes. If we did not punish, criminalize, and stigmatize people for their drug use, but instead showed empathy, support, and addressed their trauma and suffering, we would be so much better off. If people truly understood that it is not the drugs that are the problem, but the way we deal with people who are using them, we could dramatically change our society and save many lives.
Thanks, Mark, for that intervention. Jesse, Mark has just elucidated one of the crises that's going on in our country right now. We've got climate change, affordability, the effects of COVID. I'd be interested in your thoughts on mental health and social support systems and the stress that they're under, and whether we anticipate more stress going forward, and how we could see an alternative future play out, one that's more desirable. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. I'll try to be brief, and I just want to. I feel like cheering on after everyone says their words. It's all so great. I had a whole thing written. I think I'm not going to read what I was going to written. Instead, I'm going to respond maybe a little bit to the discussion and say, so yes, I think it is utterly inevitable that our mental health and social support structures will come under further stress as long as we keep doing what we're doing and going in the direction we're going, because that is the trend that has been since I think I've been alive, that has been the trend under those systems. So I suspect that will continue to do this. I wanted to maybe reframe for a second a little bit, because we're talking a lot about disruptions and all of these disruptions of the culture. I guess what I would say is, I think one of the challenges, on the big level, is that colonialism is the disruption that is ongoing on these lands, right? It is disrupted communities now for generations, disrupted ways of life, ways of being and knowing. It's for not just First Nations people, Métis and Inuit people, but of course for everyone. And I think it is an ongoing disruption that we need to come to grips with and be able to tackle, to fully understand, because so many of these things, we just heard Mark's passionate discussion of drug policy. The approach that we have done, I can only describe as a thoroughly colonial approach to this solution. This is the same approach that we apply to homelessness, poverty. They all exist within. We don't actually seek solutions outside of the colonial framework that so many of us have existed in. And I think this is one of the challenges, because the problem we're actually often trying to solve is colonialism. And if we don't actually name it and look at it, because things like poverty, houselessness, addiction, they were not issues here before colonialism occurred. We had solutions to those that involved what I'm going to name, which is community. And colonialism's big disruption of communities meant that those shared systems of kinship, of communal ties that allow for a natural care network to exist, have been eroded and replaced by commerce and work and marketplace and all of this stuff that makes it really hard for us to come to communal solutions. So I think we need to look, as community is always the answer to these things. Communities require right relations, a balancing of priorities and activities centered around common goals. And this requires relevancy, reciprocity, respectfulness, and responsibility, not just to other humans, but to our non-human kin, which includes the animals, rivers, and everything that allows us to exist on these places. And I think that all should start, and has to start, on the local level, so people can see it and it can be very tangible to them, and that we invest huge on local infrastructure, not dissimilarly to the way we did coming out of the World War, because we're coming out of a global trauma again, and we need to rebuild that sense of community that has been lost. And I think if we do that, then we can, the issues around mental health will begin to rebuild some of the networks that remove us out of an individual viewpoint of how we tackle these things into a communal viewpoint, which is going to be much easier and better for us than if we always have to think these are individual problems that I have to resolve through an individual effort. So ultimately, like, the vision of this to me is what I would describe as a reconciled Canada. And if I may make a pitch, as I'm chair of a Canada Council for the Arts, so of course it's going to come back to arts and storytelling. I think we do also need artists and storytellers to help us imagine what this future is. Artists tend to be futurists in and of themselves. They tend to give us the ideas. I'm talking to you on a tablet. The first time I ever saw a tablet was on an episode of Star Trek from about 1967. And the beautiful thing about that is the writers had no idea how you actually make a tablet, but they could imagine it. And scientists then went and figured out how to actually create it and do a thing. And so I think the more we can dream together of what our futures can look like outside of colonial thought, we can actually then get to the work of making those dreams a reality. And again, miigwech, 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 shachi miigwech for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for all the interventions. It's been a real honor to be with you and to have your insights. I think what it leaves us with is that there is a lot of work to do, but there is a lot of passion and there's a lot of vision to create a future, despite these disruptions that might be in our environment, that is filled with community and care, and a better place for all of Canada. So thank you all for being part of this panel. My great appreciation to Armine, Andrew, Mark, and Jesse, and thank you for hosting this event. So I'll turn it back over to Crystal to set the stage for the next item. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much, Shalene, Armine, Jesse, Andrew, Mark. Thank you very much for your insights on some of the disruptions that might be affecting Canada in the future.